Hello everyone. My name is Michael McFall. I'm the director here of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Thanks for coming. I thought we were going to have a small gathering, and it turned out we're using our best facilities for our best people, Jay. So welcome to Stanford. We're going to have, I hope you all saw as you came in, books are available for sale, and I hope you all do that either outside or using your iPhone and Amazon. You can do that right now or at any time during our conversation, but you can't do anything else but buy your book with your phone, okay? So those are the rules. Let me just introduce Abbas, and he'll introduce our guest today, but Abbas Milani. Milani. I just said that on Saturday, and I realized I've known Abbas since he came here at Stanford, and I know how to pronounce his name, and I did it wrong on Saturday. I just did it again. So let's all practice. Milani. Abbas, as many of you know, runs our Iranian Studies program here at Stanford. He's also a fellow at Hoover and at FSI. He very graciously gave up his Saturday morning to perform for our alums in this room and said some very interesting things about Iran. And so now we'll get to see if he was right or wrong in our conversation. So Abbas, thank you for hosting our session, and let me turn it over to you.
Good afternoon. I almost didn't make it here because I went to every room in FSI and there was something else happening because this event, as Mike referred to it, began as a luncheon. We had a room for about 50 people, and as soon as we put the RSVP, within an hour, we had 50 people. We extended it. We had 70 people. We extended it. We had 100 people. We extended it to what is now in this wonderful room. So welcome to all of you. I would like to especially welcome Ms. Christina Moghaddam. I am the Christina Moghaddam Director of Iranian Studies. Our program has been funded by Christina Moghaddam and her husband, Hamid, and she's here. And they've been supporters of the Iranian Studies program. It is their vision that Stanford has an Iranian Studies program, and it's their support that has made it now to what it has become. I also want to thank Mike, since he has come to FSI, Iranian Studies, and FSI have been working much closer together. I am now officially a part of FSI. We have a project together, an Iran Economic Vision 2040, that again is funded solely so far by Hamid and Christina Moghaddam and FSI. And it's going to, I think, be a fascinating project studying the Iranian economy.
Christina is also on the advisory council for FSI, so this is all
yes.
intimate.
Yes.
Thank you.
I want to welcome Mr. Jay Solomon, Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent for Wall Street Journal, who's here to talk about his book, aptly named The Iran Wars, Spy Games, Bank Battles, and the Secret Deals That Reshaped the Middle East. I think even if you don't agree with this or that assessment in his book, and there are assessments in the book that I think several of us in this room might have some quarrels with, I think you will concur that it's an engrossing narrative based on his in-depth reporting, his long years of experience in the region, his thorough investigative journalism, and the many unique contacts that this rich record has afforded him. What makes the narrative unique is that it tries to weave into a tapestry the many aspects of the US-Iran's fraught relationship over the last 35 years. Though it is based essentially on American sources, his interviews with people like Mousavian, one-time key member of Iran's nuclear program, and someone very aware of the inner workings of that regime, has afforded the narrative much more nuance. The other unique characteristic of the book is that it combines discussions of nuclear technology and assassination attempts with arcane banking laws intended to block Iran's access to the financial markets. Iran has been declared by scholars as having been the first arena of the Cold War in 1945. Could it also be the first salvo in a new kind of cyber war that includes attacks on military infrastructure, no less than on financial systems? Before I invite our distinguished guests to explain it all to us, let me explain the rules before the event. We are recording the event, so please be aware of this. Once Mr. Solomon has given his presentation, we will open it to Q&A. There should be mics, and hopefully you can speak into the mic so that it can be recorded in our recording. If I was to pitch the book as a film to Hollywood, I would say it is Argo meets Fargo meets The Big Short, with some dashes of James Bond, a little bit of Buster Keaton, with a lot of homage to Le Carré and to The Sopranos. So, and if I was to call the book, the film, I would call it The Years of Living Dangerously. Thank you, Mr. Solomon.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. Milani. This is a great honor to be here. I think I'll just start by first saying I found Iran from the beginning of writing this book and doing a lot of reporting that there is very little middle ground. So it was politically a very difficult book because I found the kind of the middle in Washington and internationally on the Iran situation really evaporated over the past 4 years. So trying to write a nuanced account was not easy. So I really did try to do the best I could on that front. I think I'll start by trying to give a sense of why I started doing this book. I really started to sort of get a feeling that I was getting captivated by the Iran issue, the conflict in 2006 when I was covering the Lebanon war. It was depicted very much as a conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. But being on the ground from the Lebanese side, I kept hearing whispers that, you know, this was really about a much bigger conflict with Iran and Syria and what was being described as this resistance axis of Iran and its allies through the region taking on the U.S., Israel, and its allies, that it was starting to shape on the ground in Lebanon. And that was kind of my first experience, someone who did not cover the Middle East that much during my previous career, which was in Asia, but was starting to see what I think really was, in a lot of ways, the defining conflict that started to emerge from the Bush administration into the Obama administration. And more than just Lebanon, you could see U.S. policy throughout the world starting to be focused in trying to either confront or contain Iran. In the book, I do look a lot early on about Afghanistan and Iraq, where the U.S. was coming into conflict, possibly cooperation with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the Iranian Foreign Ministry, and trying to either stabilize or actually confront each other in these countries. So it was really in the end of the Bush administration that I really did start to see this broader conflict, which obviously had been in the works to some extent since the '79 revolution, but it really seemed to pick up and start to play out across Lebanon, Palestinian territories, Syria, Iraq, the Gulf. And you could see even at the beginning of the Bush, sort of the end of the Bush administration, something the professor was talking about, that it was starting to revolutionize national security and the way it was being practiced. The cyber attacks were one, but starting in 2006 and building up even until the last years of the Obama administration, the financial warfare against Iran really was revolutionary. I don't think, and I argue in the book, there's never been a peacetime financial war against another country that was unleashed on Iran, really starting in 2006 and accelerating in 2012 when the United States government and its allies really started to attack Iran's oil wealth in a way that I don't think even people in the U.S. Treasury thought was possible. And I think in a lot of ways the book is a lot about President Obama and what I would argue from the 2008 campaign through his presidency really did seem to be the one issue that galvanized him on the foreign policy scene. And I think I was really interested on why this politician from Hawaii, who's spent time in Indonesia, became so obsessed in a lot of ways with some sort of rapprochement, or at least an attempt at rapprochement with Iran. And I think what I found in the reporting, that Iran kind of emerged in the first term of the Obama administration as a issue that kind of lots of different trends were flowing through it. When he was in the Senate, President Obama was fixated on the nuclear issue, on non-proliferation. So Iran was emerging as the one big issue in his presidency. A lot of his aides, or some of his aides, when he was still in the Senate, worked on something called the Iraq Study Group, which was a congressionally funded report to look at how to end the Iraq War. And key parts of that were engaging Iran and engaging Syria to try to extract the United States from Iran. From the Middle East conflict. And I also think Iran, given his history in a lot of ways, whether it was living in Indonesia, I think he saw in Iran a country that had problems with Western powers, with colonial powers, and this was kind of part of his world vision, that he could kind of right wrongs with some of these countries. And what was interesting going back, and a lot of this we didn't see at the time, was just how quickly the Obama administration moved to engage the Iranian government once it took office. In the end, through my reporting, we found that he wrote 5 letters. Maybe there were more, but in these letters to the supreme leader of Iran, he really was making this pitch of, the U.S. and Iran have had a troubled relationship. I understand that there have been wrongs that we can right, but if we can resolve the nuclear issue peacefully, there are many other issues or areas where we can cooperate. And so the book really shows, I think, that even back to the campaign through the entire administration, Iran was kind of the vector. It was an issue that the White House saw a lot of other issues could be resolved if the Iranian nuclear issue could be resolved. And I think that's why, putting away conspiracy theory, why it became such a high priority. In the book, I tried to focus as well on the positives and the negatives. I argue that in a lot of ways, the diplomacy and the way it was structured was incredibly successful. When Bush was leaving office, there was this perception that, this was all the United States' fault. The U.S. had been, the Iraq War, it was kind of persecuting Iran. It had the right for nuclear power. Therefore, it was very much seen as an American problem. And then President Obama, I think, by extending his hand, by trying to negotiate with the Iranians and saying that very publicly from day one, he shifted the debate, and it really did kind of come upon Iran. And I think it put pressure on Iran to engage in a way that the supreme leader probably didn't exactly want, even though elements of the government and the society definitely did. And I argue that was a very successful diplomatic maneuver, and the ability over the years to get this unwieldy coalition of countries from China, Russia, and the other members of the Security Council, the European countries, in check, and to deal with countries that were so hostile towards any engagement with Iran, whether it was Israel or Saudi Arabia or some of the other Gulf countries, was an impressive feat. And I really do dedicate a lot of this book to the financial warfare, because I remember in 2006 you saw a very deliberate escalation from the United States that no one really thought was going to work, where they started to target state banks of Iran. But it was mapped out, and I profile in the book a guy named Stuart Levy, who was the Undersecretary of Treasury, and just how thought out this was from the beginning, that if the United States could target certain nodes in the Iranian economy and basically accept the idea that foreign countries, whether it's the Russians, the Indians, Chinese, a lot of whom buy a lot of energy from Iran, they're not going to want to go around along with the United States on this, but they turned it into basically a system where you could do business with Iran, but if you do, you have to understand that you won't be able to do business with the United States, and you won't be able to use the dollar. And it was a very revolutionary way of trying to sanction a country, and it really went into every sector of the Iranian economy. It was amazing to watch over from 2006, yes, and then to the Obama administration taking over, where it went from these state banks to shipping companies to insurance companies to reinsurance companies to the airlines to the companies that fuel the airlines. They basically took out every sector of the Iranian economy on an escalating path, and in 2012 was in, I think they kind of detonated the nuclear option on the financial war, which was to sanction the central bank of Iran and get the European countries to enact a complete oil embargo on Iran, which I didn't think was possible. I didn't think you could get that many European countries to do it. I think it was a combination of both effective diplomacy and having a president in Iran of Ahmadinejad who was so alienating other countries that it kind of forced the Europeans to get on board. So I really do try to map out these successful efforts against Iran, but I also highlight what I think have been the cost or the risk going now and forward. One of them was trying to balance all these different interests. I do think the U.S. alienated in a lot of ways some of the closest allies the United States has in that region, whether it was Israel or the Saudis or the UAE. And I know a lot of people might think, well, that's, you should alienate them. It's always a contentious issue, but I do think the fact that much of the U.S. diplomacy, at least early on, was done behind the back of allies, even though I know U.S. officials I've talked to said you couldn't have done this type of diplomacy with these countries against it involved. But I think some of what we're seeing now with a really aggressive Saudi military campaign in Yemen, the proxy war now in Syria that keeps to escalate, I think part of that is some of these Arab allies don't really trust the United States, and they're basically going alone in a lot of ways, and that's part of why we're seeing such horrific violence in the region. I also think one of the more controversial elements, both of the Iran policy and the book, which these gentlemen are experts on, was the 2009 Green Movement, the kind of uprising against the re-election of President Ahmadinejad. I think there is a concern that was a bit of a lost moment. I don't think I try to, in the book, really say this was a very complicated situation where you had some dissidents or democracy supporters in Iran telling the White House, don't say anything, don't touch this, you're only going to brand us lackeys, so stay away from it. Others were saying, you need to at least provide moral support to the Green Movement, because there's likely to be a crackdown anyways. But I think in the book I kind of outlined the fact that during the crucial days, the U.S. really did pull back, and the Supreme Leader basically cracked down anyways, using the justification that it was a Western American-backed plot, and really did clean it. And I do think the White House's fixation on a nuclear agreement with Iran is at least part of their calculations, because they had all these channels to the Supreme Leader already in the works, and there was no sort of golden, silver bullet that this movement was really going to do anything. So I think the decision to sort of pull back was in some ways related to the nuclear diplomacy, and that time will tell whether there's another kind of opening or opportunity like that in the near future. Syria too is I think I've found it very difficult to kind of cut away the Iran issue from the Syria issue, and I think one of the parts of the book that I found the most kind of pushback from the administration is how was the Iran and the Syria issues connected. And a lot of this stuff was done in secret. So at the time, and I found this one of the most interesting parts in going back and writing the book, was in 2013 in August, President Obama said he was going to enforce red lines when the Assad regime used chemical weapons against civilians. And, there was this U-turn, and none of us knew, you probably did, but most people didn't know that there were these very high-level talks in Oman between the U.S. and Iran, and they were getting very close to basically what was an interim nuclear agreement. And we didn't know these things were happening at the same time. The administration swears that there was no connection between the decision to back away from the military strikes on the Syrian regime and the secret diplomacy. But I interviewed Iranian officials who basically said, if the U.S. had started bombing the Assad regime, which is Iran's closest ally, it spent billions of dollars in defending that, it would have been very difficult for these negotiations to continue. The Revolutionary Guard and the Supreme Leader's office, at least they told me, would have suspended the talks for a while, or potentially derailed it. And this was known on some level by the White House, even though now they said there's still no disconnect. But if you follow where U.S. policy went on Syria from 2013 to now, it's a pretty huge shift. Initially, it was basically calling for the ouster of Assad, and then in one of these letters President Obama wrote to the Supreme Leader, it was basically, look, if we can get this nuclear agreement, we can cooperate against the Islamic State, and you should know that the rebels we're supporting, the airstrikes, are not targeting the Assad regime. So it kind of moved over time to a point where we basically were almost had our policy in alignment with Iran and the Russians, and I think that's not. I do think there was a connection. Eventually, this led to the nuclear agreement last year, which was a long slog. I try to point out in the book that it does provide an opening. It does provide political space, and the hope very much is that you take away the threat of war, you pull back the sanctions, the economy will open up, the younger elements of the population will kind of see an opening to the West, and gradually over time you are going to see a betterment of relationships. The U.S. and Iran does have a lot of shared interests, and that you will kind of move forward. And I think that's a possibility, and I definitely in the book try not to rule that out, but I also try to highlight that the U.S. did move a long way from the initial positions the U.S. government had on a lot of on the nuclear issue, on the military dimensions of Iran's program. Initially, it was we didn't want the Iranians to have any ability to produce nuclear fuel. We wanted them to give up their ballistic missile program. We wanted them to dismantle a lot of this infrastructure. We wanted to maintain an arms embargo on Iran's ability to import and export. And a lot of this stuff will get rolled back. The infrastructure remains in place, so it is capped. But in 10 years, they can have an industrial, 10 to 15 years, they can have an industrial scale program. And what I worry about is if there isn't this political change, if there isn't any shift, where is this conflict going to be in 10 years? The financial sanctions that I've talked about, I think it's virtually impossible to put back in place what was there. It was so difficult, and it took so long that short of Iran implementing or testing a nuclear weapon, they would have to do something very provocative, I think, to get all of these different players back involved. So you could have another crisis down the road. And my fear is you could have a reprise in some ways, even though they're different countries, of North Korea, where the U.S. did have an agreement which was similar. You basically gave economic incentives to the North Koreans to get them to cap their program, and that agreement started to fray very quickly because there was never really any improvement in the relationship. And I worry if there isn't an improvement in relationship, the agreement will remain very fragile. And it's only been a year, but I think in a lot of ways what we've seen since the agreement hasn't been particularly encouraging. I remember a lot of the negotiations at Vienna, kind of in the background was this belief that if we can get the nuclear agreement signed, we can get agreement, we can work together in a similar format to end the Syrian civil war. We can take this as a building block. And people didn't realize at the time was that the Russians and the Iranians were secretly holding meetings in Moscow at that time, and just a few weeks after the agreement to launch a joint military operation in Syria. and you know, they basically doubled down their support for the Assad regime. They haven't reduced support at all. So I think one of the first areas, at least I was looking for, where there might be some building on the Iranian nuclear agreement was in Syria, and that hasn't happened. I think there's been a crackdown in a lot of ways on Iranian Americans. You've seen just last week 2 prominent Iranian Americans get sentenced to 10 years in prison. And I know one of the gentlemen is an Iranian American businessman, and I think he was seen as being potentially one of the early, kind of the front of the spear of promoting an economic engagement. And I think, at least what I think was happening, is that the supreme leader of Iran, in a lot of ways, has kind of gotten, at least in the short term, what he wanted. He was worried about financial collapse, so he needed negotiations, and he did get economic relief, but he didn't want some huge infusion of money and capital going into the country. He wanted to be able, I think he was just as much worried about that in some ways as the financial collapse. So I think you hear a lot of complaints from Iranian officials, particularly the president and the foreign minister, that they're not getting the benefits of the deal. But if you really look at the numbers, their economy is supposed to grow by 6%, 5% next year, after contracting by 2 or 3% during the height of the sanctions. So if you're the supreme leader right now, I think you might have had a pretty good balance between maintaining most of your military and nuclear infrastructure with the potential down the road to have weapons if you want it. You staved off a real acute economic collapse, but you're also kind of keeping Western influence in check, American influence in check. And whether he'll be able to do that, whether the country really does change after he dies, that's the part of the book, and I think the question no one really knows, but hopefully we can talk about this now. So thank you very much.
A couple of comments, if I may,
Sure.
to raise a couple of issues. One is that I think there are 2 very important strategic notions in your book. One is this cyber financial war, which is very successful. The other one that I think is a little more controversial, as you pointed, is the argument that the Obama administration pulled back on Syria as part of a deal with Iran. If the nuclear deal is the great success of the Obama administration, the Syrian policy is this big failure that is going to, I think, taint the Middle East and taint his reputation for Syria. I don't see any evidence. I mean, I'm not in the context, but the Iranians doubled down on Khamenei doubled down on Assad before the deal was made. Khamenei increased Iran's financial aid to Assad to the tune of $7 billion at the height of the financial. As Iranian economy was virtually collapsing, as Iran had lost almost 70% of its money value, they kept the Syrian currency by pumping in a lot of money. And part of the reason the financial system worked is that the Iranians miscalculated. They thought if the US puts Iran's oil, there's a paper they wrote, the price of oil is going to go to 200 and Europeans are not going to sign on. The price of oil collapsed because they miscalculated. Without that miscalculation, I don't know how successful this financial deal is going to be. But I think the details that you provide are absolutely fascinating in terms of how the system was laid out, and many people you never heard of who found ways to actually achieve this rather remarkable success. And the last point you passingly refer to, the success of this option needs to be understood in the context of what other options there were at the time. Israel was ready to attack Iran. Perez says stopping Israel's attack on Iran was one of the great accomplishments of his life. That would have changed the Middle East in ways far more profound than anything else. So part of the success of that story is not just that it brought Iranians to the deal, but it also stopped military confrontation. So let's have.
There's just one thing I want to talk about with on the oil front. I do think that was one of the most interesting parts of researching this book, because I found out as early as 2006 under the Bush administration, there was talk in the Treasury Department led by this Undersecretary of Treasury Stuart Levy saying we should start sanctioning Bank Markazi, the central bank of Iran. And under Bush, Hank Paulson came back and said this is insanity. If you hit the central bank of Iran, like you said, their oil exports will get cut off, and Iran is number 2 or number 3 in OPEC. We're going to have a huge shock in oil prices. It's going to boomerang and hit us. So they held back under Bush, even though they were thinking about it back then. And then under Obama early on, this was kind of out there, and Geithner was raising the same concerns. And these were real concerns. I don't want to dismiss them. And what was amazing in the way this was executed, both from Bush and into Obama, was you could see under Obama in the first kind of months, he started to send emissaries to China, to India, and basically said, using in some ways Israel as a bad cop, saying, look, your energy comes from Iran. You've got the Israelis threatening to attack, which will destroy your ability to source energy from Iran. You should help us take Iran off the oil markets. We'll get the Saudis, we'll get the Kuwaitis to jack up production. We're starting to produce some more. And they did create this balance over time, and part of it was luck because the economies in the world were slowing down, but they basically increased production, brought Iran down, and they executed it without causing this oil shock. And I don't think most people thought that was possible. And like you were saying, that the Israel element was always kind of in the room. And at first the administration would use it to further their policy. They'd say, look, we don't know if we can control these guys. Because of that, you have to help us make sure these sanctions work. So we kind of stave off the military issue or the threat of an Israeli attack. But there's a couple of chapters in the book where I think I highlight what was really the most dangerous time, which was kind of late 2000, 2011, early 12, when there were a number of assassinations of scientists in Tehran, senior nuclear scientists, and then there was retaliation. There were heaps of plots from Mombasa to Bangkok, New Delhi, Bulgaria, traced back either to Hezbollah and Iran. And there was a fear in the White House that this is going to escalate and get out of control. And at least officials I had talked to said, like, part of the reason to really push the secret track and to get diplomacy going was that it was going to be very hard for the Israelis to launch any strikes if there was progress on the diplomatic front. So it was all kind of churning at the same time.
Any questions? All crystal clear? Mike?
So first, I haven't read the book, but the presentation was fantastic. So I look forward to reading the book. I'm writing my own book, and I have a chapter on Iran. And I do know some of the things you referred to, but I want to do a little triangulation between us on a couple of historical things, and then ask you a question about the future. So the first question in my mind, this relationship between Syria and Iran that you discussed, and I think it's a plausible, we're on the record, so I'm going to be careful here, but plausible hypothesis, and I look forward to reading the evidence from your perspective about why not to strike. I was in the government at the time. I was U.S. ambassador at the time. The decision, the final piece of the decision to work with the Russians to do the chemical weapons deal was done when Obama met with Putin on the sidelines of the G20 meeting in St. Petersburg in September. There was lots of work leading up to that, as you would well imagine. That just doesn't happen overnight. But one of the things we were debating relating to Iran was the opposite way. And I want to get your reaction to it from your reporting back home, because I was in Moscow at the time. Some were making the argument that if we failed to show our credibility in terms of this red line, that would undermine our credibility vis-a-vis Iran in terms of the use of force down the road. And you know as well as I do that the president always said that. We're never taking that off the table. My friends in the Pentagon made those plans. Those existed. And lots of people here write about coercive diplomacy and why it's necessary for it to be credible. So I'm interested in that, the flip side, that may have been, and then maybe then we gave away everything, right? Because we had lost our credibility and the Iranians pocketed it.
Right.
So that's the first historical question. Second historical question is about the Russians. I know this is going to be a little odd for you to answer this, but it comes from me. But, after 1929, a great achievement from my point of view in terms of that. That was UN Security Council Resolution 1929 in May 2010 when we secured that resolution. We then moved to do all these other things that that part of your book I have read and brilliantly. You got to buy this book. And guys like Stuart Levy, who I know well, I mean, these are real heroes that did extraordinary things. And I say that I want to remind you, he worked for the Bush administration, then stayed on with us. And just a brilliant, great guy, by the way. But we did these other things that you mentioned in your talk. And of course, the worry was always that the Russians, they were pissed off. I can report that to you. They were very upset that we did these sanctions beyond 1929. And at times, with people that then replaced Stuart, we marched into the central bank in Moscow, into their big banks, and made exactly the argument that you did in your presentation. If you can do this, but you're gonna have trouble doing business with us, and you're gonna have trouble doing business in dollars. And I have to say, in retrospect, I'm surprised that they went along with us, especially a couple of their commercial banks that had big economic interests in Iran, and especially after, things went bad in 2012 in terms of U.S.-Russian relations, and then got even worse in Ukraine after Ukraine, and yet through all of that, they didn't defect, right? So from your point of view, help us from your reporting, why did they stay? And then the other last big question, maybe it should be at the end, not now. So maybe a boss can write it down and we'll come back to it. But I think your characterization is absolutely correct in my reading. From day one, September 21st, 2009, how to deal with Iran was the central foreign policy challenge for our administration. My colleague at the NSC, a guy named Puneet Talwar, we had a secret pact that in many ways, everything I did was subsidiary and supportive to what he's doing. I'm exaggerating, but we did have a secret pact. And we just joked about it the day the agreement was signed. And everything was seen through that prism. I think your take on that is correct. What happens next? Like, what's the Iran policy now? Like, you've been focused for 8 years on that one thing. What's, as you looked across things and you hinted at certain things that were taken off the table because of that agreement, what's the grand strategy for dealing with Iran today? Because one issue may have been parked at least for 10 or 15 years, but of course we have other big issues to deal with in Iran. So maybe that's towards the end, but I really, you know more about this than anybody. I want to hear what you have to say on that.
Sure. I mean, on the military option and the red lines, I mean, I do think that the way that was handled, whether it was kind of cognizant, totally in the president's mind that, they said there was no direct threat from the Iranians to walk if the attacks had started against the Assad regime, but it's knowing how fundamental the Assad regime is to the Iranians. The idea that these diplomats would have just been able to keep going if we were taking out the Syrian Air Force, I'm very skeptical about. But I do think the failure to back up that red line in 2013 and then the acceleration of the negotiations, as a reporter, I didn't really believe the red line very quickly because you were getting kind of conflicting statements from the White House. They'd say all options are on the table, but then conversely they said, well, if we were to bomb Iran, that would guarantee they'd go for a nuclear weapon because they'd feel, under siege and they still have the knowledge. So they weren't publicly giving up the military option, but when they were saying that in private, as a reporter, I just believe, well, they're never going to attack. I mean, if that's really what they think, you're going to guarantee them a bomb. Why would you do it? So I do think the combination of not enforcing those red lines, and that belief, which might be correct, but the military option, as the negotiations accelerated from 2013 through the next year, it didn't seem like it was on the table. On the sanctions, I mean, to me, what was incredible was at a time when people talk about American power diminishing or not having the same power that we used to, the ability of the Treasury Department and a 90-year-old district attorney in New York, Robert Morgenthau, to enforce these sanctions. People forget how much, I think, between Credit Lyonnais, Lloyd's of London, Standard Chartered, they paid billions of dollars in fines. Some of them are still being charged for violating Iran sanctions. And even if you're a Russian bank, by and large, of any capacity, I think you'd have to have access to the dollar. You can't run that risk. So I do think there were a lot of countries that didn't really want to do the U.S. any favors, but just the fact that this wasn't a Security Council resolution, it basically, I think, understood that companies and countries would cheat like they did with Iraq and the oil for food scandal. You just assume people would cheat, but if you make it into their own interest, i.e. we need to have dollars, the calculation changed, and I think that's why the Russians and the Chinese stayed on board. And this is, I think, one of the more critical parts of the book as the negotiations went on, was that the Secretary Kerry and others seemed to be like talking down the sanctions, saying, well, this can't hold. We don't think these can hold. And I'm sure they couldn't have held forever, but if you really look at the really nasty sanctions that went into place, it was really only from mid-2012 to 2013, which was the central bank sanctions, the oil embargo, and kicking Iran off the international SWIFT market. I mean, that was really only a year, and they really scrambled. So I think my question is, all the leverage seemed to be on the U.S. side, and oil was collapsing. It went from $140 a barrel to $40 during that time. So I remember the French during the negotiations would sometimes, in private, they'd tell Kerry, like, why do we keep setting these deadlines? You're playing into the Iranian hand. Don't set any deadlines. They're the ones facing all this financial pressure. So I didn't know if they didn't understand the magnitude the sanctions were having, but even today, after the agreement, there's still a lot of banks who will not touch Iran because they're still worried about Treasury. So I think that's still out there. And finally, the future is going to be interesting because I mean, I've talked to a lot of Clinton's people lately, and the sense I get, even though they're cautious, is they supported the agreement, but they don't think it's been enforced, i.e. Iran has launched 10 ballistic missiles. There hasn't been any pushback. There was missiles fired out of Yemen on U.S. destroyers a couple weeks ago by militias that do get support from Iran. Were these ordered by Iran? Probably not, or no one knows. But these types of things keep going on in the Iranian role in Syria. So I think the sense I get is that the Clinton people are like, okay, we're going to stick to this agreement, but we're going to start enforcing these other areas that the White House, the Obama administration said they would. And then the question arises, what happens? Because the Iranians have said repeatedly, any new sanctions against us are a violation of the agreement. We could pull out. And I think they've used that effectively over the past year to people call it the kind of the nuclear blackmail. If you challenge us anywhere else, the deal is off. I think right now the Iranians are still trying to get their economy back, their money that's coming back. It is starting to have an effect, even though it's not maybe as great as some has hoped. But I don't see them pulling the plug. But 3 or 4 years down the pipe, when there's a lot of the people who created this, who are invested in the deal, are gone, if there isn't any real change in the relationship, I think it's always going to be very fragile.
Yes, now that we are in cahoots with Iran, I read that Saudi Arabia and the U.S. are going to have problems in the future. I wanted your take on the future with this triangle.
No, I think that what has been one of the most delicate balancing acts for the Obama administrations, and it's gone on for decades, but there was always this tension where there was so much public focus on the Israelis being opposed to the agreement in a lot of ways because they were so much more willing to be vocal about it. They seem to understand Washington or our political system better than the Saudis or play it better. But yeah, the Saudis and the Emiratis were always in the background saying, you're married to us and now you're cheating on us. So what's going on in the future? And I do think, and President Obama's talked about it kind of publicly in some interviews he's given where he wants a better balance between the Sunni and the Shiite world, the Saudi and the Iranians, and that they could sort of better share the Middle East. And that did not go well down in Saudi Arabia at all. And I do think there is a belief in Saudi Arabia that the Americans are kind of turning their back on us, and they are taking more aggressive actions, whether it's this war in Yemen that I don't think, this is another fallout from the nuclear agreement, I think, is that it's kind of skewed in some ways because there were a lot of people in the White House and the State Department who did not think this war in Yemen was a good idea from day one, but they kind of went along with it in some ways because they knew the Saudis were so pissed off about the nuclear agreement that, okay, we've got to keep their trust, so we're kind of going to go along with this war. And now they seem to be a bit stuck. The war, there's this bombing of a funeral a few weeks ago. It doesn't seem to be going well. But on the other hand, it doesn't seem to have gotten any goodwill from the Iranian side when their allies in Yemen are shooting missiles at us. So I think it's going to be very difficult. And there has been a pretty big shift, I think, in the Washington political space towards Saudi Arabia. There's this legislation passed a few weeks ago about where basically Americans could sue the Saudi government tied to 9/11 and stuff. And the White House opposed it, but they didn't seem to fight it that much. And I think the Saudis saw that as a sign, like, what side are these guys on? They didn't really try to block this legislation until it was too late. So I think that is going to be a very contentious issue. I think in some ways, if this deal went through and you saw the Iranians like really embracing the United States, which hasn't happened, maybe it would be a little more clear. But now it seems like both sides are kind of alienated. So it's going to be a big issue facing the next president.
But on Saudi Arabia, don't you also think that the elephant in the room that is often not talked about is Wahhabism and ISIS and Saudi ideological support for it? It's being talked about increasingly, but they are worried, as everybody else should be worried, I think, that the United States, that is a major source of intellectual support for what is emerging as a serious threat.
Yeah. No, I think the Obama seems like he's been pretty vocal about that, and I think he's right. I think what's hard in a lot of these places, like I don't think most people who watched the Syria conflict believed that, from day one this was a jihadist threat. It was kind of as a pretty peaceful protest that the Assad regime, with support from the Iranians and Russian, cracked down in horrible ways, and it fueled Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State because it was, you had a minority Alawite government cracking down on the Sunnis. And in Iraq, too, there's still this balance where you have a Shiite-dominant government after Saddam that hasn't been very successful in kind of taming the sectarian nature of that country, in parts because the Iranians have, I don't think many people have thought the Iranians have played a particularly constructive role in Iraq as trying to heal these wounds. So it's kind of this intractable conflict right now, and the U.S. does not seem particularly well positioned to try to heal a how many thousand-year rift, but it's nasty in all directions.
It's Lady right here.
I have been reading in the Wall Street Journal about the openings of airports, international airports in Iran, as well as large shopping centers bursting up and many European companies coming in. Are we going to lose out to China in the economic trade with Iran if we continue to tiptoe?
No, that's a good point to raise, because it is true. We cut this deal, but most sanctions on U.S. firms remain in place. So, the Chinese have been they never really left Iran, even though they had to pull back at least on the oil front, and the Russians were there. But in the trips I've made, the interesting thing is the Iranian people and the companies, they do want American business desperately. They're not getting the technology, Apple software, all that stuff from the Chinese and the Russians. In a lot of ways, the Russians economy, they're an oil economy, so they don't really get much from the Russians, and I think from the Chinese, they don't get much. So there's a desire for it, but yeah, there is this kind of imbalance in the fact that we cut this deal, and our companies are going to be the last in. I don't really know how that's going to get decided. I think the White House, they are trying to sort of push it as far as they can. Boeing is now allowed to sell billions of dollars of aircraft to Iran, so that would be the first big American business deal, and it could be the start of something bigger. I still do not fully understand how this deal is going to get financed, because so many banks are still so worried about going into Iran. But there is that thought, both on the business side and in the White House, that using business is a way to pry open that place. But the Iranians are aware of that, and we were talking about early on. Some of the people who've been arrested in recent months in Iran are Iranian Americans, are European Iranians who would play a kind of key role in trying to promote business, and the conservative elements, the hardline elements know that, and I think that's why these people have been targeted.
Thank you for the talk. In your presentation, you emphasize the circumstances which enabled this playbook of enforcing and implementing sanctions on Iran to be successful. My question is, to what extent is this playbook applicable in other regions, in other conflicts, as the case may be in the relationship with Russia, and therefore, how much of the success of the Iran wars, if the sanctions were the centerpiece of it, was dependent on the rhetoric that came out of Iran that enabled these sanctions to be so effective?
Yeah.
And can it be replicated elsewhere as a peaceful resolution to conflicts?
That's a good question. It is true. One of the more interesting interviews I had in the book was the deputy central bank governor. This was of Iran in 2014, and this guy had been out. He was a academic who had worked for the former president Khatami and been kind of marginalized under Ahmadinejad, but he describes coming back into office after Rouhani was elected, and they knew the economy was bad, but when they actually saw the books, the place was, it kind of got a double whammy, Iran. The Ahmadinejad government so mismanaged the economy that there was hundreds of billions of dollars that were basically unaccounted for. So when the Rouhani government came in, the only way they could really get hard currency was to get the nuclear agreement and bring money back. So it was unique in the sense that you had, under the Ahmadinejad government, an administration that was, Holocaust denying, sacking the British embassy in Tehran. There was a lot of things they did that kind of fueled this and played into our favor. I think one of the more interesting cases now will be North Korea, because, and I talk about it in the book, the playbook in some ways was honed against North Korea under the Bush administration, when there was this one pretty small bank in Macau that the North Koreans were laundering all sorts of money through. And the US Treasury didn't even really sanction it. They just said this bank is money laundering. And it caused the entire North Korean, their ability to access any foreign money, to choke up. And that I think really was kind of a aha moment for these guys in Treasury, that you could do something different. And I think for the Clinton administration, North Korea might be the first big crisis they face, and there is this belief that we can try to use the Iran playbook. And what will be interesting about this is to really hit North Korea, you'd have to see them do what they did in the Iran case, i.e. if you're any bank doing business or any sort of trade with North Korean firms, you're going to get sanctioned too. And 90% of North Korea's trade goes through China. So they'd have to really be willing to take on Chinese companies, many of them state-owned, in order to try to replicate what happened in Iran. And it's unclear. There's always been this tension on North Korea under Bush, under Obama, that if you want to pressure North Korea, you have to do it with China, and we've always tried to work with them. And the Chinese, they've kind of always said, well, we don't want them to have a bomb, but they've not been willing to really tie the financial screws. And I'm still very skeptical they will. So the question is, would Chinese firms start getting sanctioned? There was a case a couple weeks ago, which I don't know if this is the beginning of it, where Treasury sanctioned this a Communist Party member who was laundering money on behalf of the North Koreans. They sanctioned all of her companies inside China, and the Chinese actually cooperated. They froze her assets, but I think North Korea will be maybe the first test case, but Russia also is, as he knows, to target the Russian economy, you have to be willing to go after a lot of European companies that are in bed with them. You have to be willing to target their energy economy, and that is very difficult to do.
Could you wait for 1 second, please?
Thank you. 2 questions. One is, looking ahead 10 to 20 years, why won't Iran be the superpower dominant force in the Middle East? And the second question, which you might come to a little later, would be, what will be the effect of the wider availability of drone technology and drone weapons to all the parties in the Middle East?
Iran's role in the region, I think in the book I kind of laid out a scenario where the U.S. has done a lot of things in the past decade that really helped Iran's role. I don't think the book is not complimentary of the Bush administration's invasion of Iraq, because it really does show how the Iranians, in a lot of ways, were basically waiting on the borders for Saddam Hussein to be overthrown, because they had so many assets and proxies inside of Iraq that they activated them as soon as the war started, and were really able, after fighting a horrific 8-year war with Iraq, were able to get an incredible amount of influence in Iraq. And in Syria and Yemen and Lebanon, the Iranian role has definitely expanded. And historically, Iran was, going back centuries, was the dominant player in the Persian Gulf. I guess one question longer term is, if I tried the book not to overplay Iran as a power, because while they have been very effective at spy games and asymmetrical warfare, their economy still is not in great shape. And even while it's growing, you still have a youthful population. There's not enough jobs. You still see a huge brain drain from that country. And the kind of euphoria when Rouhani was elected seems to have diminished a lot, that the changes they had hoped haven't happened yet. If he gets a second term next year, maybe there will. So I do think U.S. policies has played a lot of role in helping Iran spread its influence, but they still do have a lot of internal problems that you don't want to, you don't want to overplay them, play their role either. God's drone warfare. That's one thing I didn't go in depth into the book, but I do. The Iranians have their own drones. They've captured ours and recalibrated them. So I'm sure they're getting much more sophisticated as they capture ours. Yeah.
Sorry, my question is about U.S. government and U.S. Academic community's understanding of the Iran regime. As an Iranian American, there is a dictator who has God's support and military support to run a country. So when we talk about a president, we think of a US president, a French president, another president. He really doesn't have the kind of power that a dictator running the country has. So with the dictator, with his bureau that manages his orders infiltrated through the whole infrastructure in the country, with a military that's under his control, not accountable, none of these are accountable, a constitution that's gives him ultimate power and no accountability. How do we miscalculate when we are hopeful? I mean, as people in this country, we are hopeful of, yes, the educated people, the younger people, people who love America, but you really don't have the kind of power to run the country. So my question has to do with, in what ways do we misunderstand and are not used to dealing with a country and a government that's so unusually structured?
Right.
And just that going into the future, how do we
I mean,
do that?
it did seem to me that the Obama administration understood early on that past U.S. governments had made mistakes and that they had tried to work with the president or through middlemen who weren't part of the Supreme Leader's office. And, you know, President Obama started sending letters directly to the Supreme Leader as soon as he came into office, and he got, I know of at least one response. So they seem to understand where the power lied. What was fascinating and always very difficult to understand, at least in the negotiations, where you'd see Javad Zarif, the foreign minister who studied in San Francisco and lived in the U.S. for 20 years, or another deputy named Ravanchi who went to University of Kansas, or Salehi, the head of the atomic energy, went to MIT. They had these very sophisticated negotiators who understood the U.S. very well because they all had lived here, and it was always trying to understand, like, you know, how much influence do these guys really have with the Supreme Leader and who's really in charge. And it was always difficult to exactly know for sure what at least on the nuclear front, I think where the Iranians were very skillful in maybe ways we weren't, was they kind of played this game where Zarif would, you know, say one thing in Vienna, saying, okay, maybe we'll come down to 5,000 centrifuges, and then Khomeini would give a speech in Iran saying, no, we want 100,000. And you look at the final agreement, they've gone down to 5,000, but in 10 years they can have 100,000. So who won? I mean, I think in a lot of ways it was structured in a way that his red lines were respected, and the way I think Zarif would tell the U.S. officials, you know, I can only go so far, was sophisticated and successful. I think our political system, i.e. the U.S. system, you had the Congress and the White House at loggerheads, and I think the White House probably should have been a little bit more. Obama would come out and say, I'm going to veto anything the Congress does, and from my perspective, Congress, as the negotiations started to go into a final round, said, okay, we're going to put sanctions in place in a year if there's no deal. But it also there were a lot of waivers that the president, if there was progress, could have kept these at play. And rather than kind of using Congress as Zarif you seem to use the Supreme Leader, Obama would just come out and say, I'm gonna veto these guys. I thought he should have played this good cop, bad cop a little bit better. But to your main point, I think now we're in this period where the Khomeini and his people really seem to be pushing back a lot more on Rouhani and Zarif, and there's a question who will be reelected. But I think there is a fear that the U.S. really had these guys in a financial noose, and you know, Rouhani was telling the Supreme Leader, this is a national security crisis now. This isn't just about banking and money, and you know, we pulled that leverage back, and it's going to be very hard to get it back. And does the money that does start going into Iran entrench the hardliners? The first deals I've read about all seem to be going to either businesses close to the charities of the Supreme Leader's office or to the IRGC. And maybe that over time breaks down, but at least initially I think there is a risk that the money going in goes to these hardline elements and strengthens them. Yeah, it's an oligarchy in a lot of ways. So
One estimate has it that of about 170 possible deals, I heard this from an American corporation, that they think 3/4 of it will go to the three organizations that you mentioned. The organization, the IRGC funds, the Foundation for the Dispossessed, and the fund that Khomeini controls. These three are poised to control almost 3/4 of every agreement, and they stopped the agreement, the oil agreement, before they got the first dib on it.
Right.
The second one went to Russia. So they're marking their territory rather strongly.
So there are reasonable agreements or readings of the agreement that was signed.
I don't think that's.
I am speaking into the mic. There we go.
I hear you.
Thank you. There are reasonable readings that say that the agreement that was signed moves out but doesn't eliminate the period of time in which Iran can weaponize nuclear technology. 7 years, 10 years, 15 years, whatever. If I'm a Saudi leader sitting in Riyadh or the leader of Egypt sitting in Cairo, how do I not take this as a clock ticking on my own efforts to build a nuclear weapon, or plausibly threaten to build a nuclear weapon to counter this country that is my sworn blood religious enemy? How does that play out?
Right. No, I mean, experts talk of a nuclear cascade, and this was, I always found that was a legitimate criticism of the agreement, i.e., you're the Saudis, you're the Egyptians, or the Turks. You basically now know that Iran has this capacity. They have the ability to make it basically an industrial scale program in 10 to 15 years. And in my estimation, one of the more problematic parts of the agreement was, for years there was this demand that Iran needs to come clean on how close it got to a bomb. We knew they were doing tests in a military base called Parchin, and that we kind of had a sense of what they were doing, and that they had to come clean. And in the final agreement of the deal, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, basically had this roadmap with the Iranians where they had to do a few things to address the weaponization issue. But as a reporter who covered it closely, it was basically whitewashed. All the scientists they asked to see, the Iranians said no. The documents they asked to see, they said they were forged. They got one visit to this military base, Parchin, and they took soil samples. And one of the stories I'm still amazed didn't get more focus was, despite the fact that this whole process was kind of cut short, they did find traces of enriched uranium on this base. And U.S. officials I talked to said there was really no reason it would have been there unless it was being used in some sort of weapons testing, even if it had happened 15 years ago. And that, 5 years ago, this would have been a huge smoking gun, and it was just kind of put aside, and there haven't been any more visits to the site to figure out exactly what's going on. So I do think that is the risk. If you're a Saudi or some of these other countries, you kind of know they were close to a bomb. They never really had to pay a price for it. They're going to be allowed to have an industrial scale program. So in 10 or 15 years, and they've talked about it, the other side will say, well, they don't have the capacity. But there is a long history of Pakistani-Saudi support, cooperation, and I think if they really wanted to, they could probably buy a bomb or call one in for Pakistan. So I think that issue of the cascade the White House really diminished it or played it down largely on the idea that the Saudis wouldn't want to risk, the type of isolation that the Iranians face. But when you look at just how vicious this competition is between those two countries, you wonder if they're going to, like you suggested, hedge their bets over the next 10 to 15 years. And I personally wouldn't rule it out.
So you briefly mentioned the conflict in Syria and how Russia, Iran, and the U.S. interests are aligned in combating ISIS. I was wondering whether you see any improvement in U.S.-Iran relations in the military conflict in Syria.
No. I mean, there's always been this disconnect in Syria where particularly the Russians saying, well, our military operations there are to combat the terrorists. But for the first part of this conflict, at least, they were largely targeting not ISIS, but groups that the United States were supporting, and other rebel groups. So a lot of their military operations weren't focused on ISIS. They were focused on basically weeding out groups that were being supported by us or our allies. So, there's been a real attempt in the last few months by Secretary of State Kerry to try to come to some sort of agreement with the Russians, not talking about the Iranians directly, but we could share intelligence and try to coordinate our military operations in Syria to target ISIS. And kind of under this talk, there's kind of an unstated recognition that President Assad wouldn't go anywhere for a while. But even these attempts didn't go anywhere, and you can see the Russians, the Syrians, and the Iranians really like doubling down and trying to basically deliver some knockout punches in Syria and take the largest city in Syria, Aleppo. I think it's time to our own political calendar. They want to do this before our election, or while we're sort of politically not fully focused.
Unhinged.
Yeah, unhinged. So there was a lot of hope that there would be some sort of coordination in Syria, and I just don't see it. And I mean, because this talk is a lot about Iran, I've found it kind of strange in recent months where the U.S. administration is really critical about Syrian war crimes in Syria, but Iran somehow gets a pass when they've played probably the biggest outside role. Maybe the Russian role is bigger now because they have airstrikes, but if you track it back to the start of the war and just how much money and soldiers and tens of thousands of militia that the Iranians have mobilized from Lebanon, Iraq, Afghanistan to fight inside Syria, they've played a huge role in these atrocities, but they've somehow gotten a free pass in recent months, which I don't fully understand.
Do we have, how much time do we have? You want to sign some books, right? He's going to be able to sign.
Is this on?
Okay.
Yeah.
2 points.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much for your talk. The sanctions were, as you expressed, were met with quite a bit of skepticism, domestically and in Iran.
And in
nobody
Israel.
believed this was going to work. So there was a sense of newness, there was a sense of shock and awe when it started working. Can it be repeated now that I'm sure there's some defensive mechanism to protect against it? My second point is, we talked about Saudi Arabia as elephant in the room. I think the bigger elephant in the room is oil, and the fact that we are less dependent on oil these days. So this will dramatically impact our policy toward Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and so on. So how do you see that within the next 10 to 15 years as we become totally independent of, Middle East oil?
Yeah.
Could I also ask you
Sure.
to connect that to what Mike's last question was? I think this sort of segues nicely into it. How do you foresee U.S. strategy in the years to come in the next administration?
Sure. I mean, on the first question, I think building up those sanctions really took 10 years or so to put in place. And his first question was, the success of the sanctions and whether they could be re-implemented or reinstated against Iran down the road. And I think it's going to be very, very difficult because yeah, it took basically a decade, an unbelievable amount of groundwork to do it. It took a lot of mistakes by the Ahmadinejad government, basically, alienating Iran from the international community by Holocaust denial and stuff like that. It seems to me that even the hardline elements realized that we didn't need to throw gas on the fire. We can keep doing what we're doing, and to reimpose those sanctions as businesses start going back in and start investing, even potentially Boeing. They would have to do something, in my mind, something extremely stupid to get that type of financial pressure on them again. Oil has definitely, it's not stated, but I think you do see the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia, it is changing. You can feel that in Washington. And I think, the lack of dependence on energy factors into that play. I remember about 2 years ago when the Saudis really started to jack up oil production. Part of it was definitely to hurt the Iranians and the Russians for their regional play, but you'd also hear from some Saudis they wanted to see how far they could take out North Dakota or some of these fracking companies because they were now competition. So the relationship has definitely changed, and I sometimes energy is secular, but it does seem like it's definitely entered a new phase. And looking ahead, I assume if it's in the next 4 to 8 years, if it's Clinton, I think she does. Her people talk about a fear that Obama overcorrected, like the Bush administration overexposed the U.S., but Obama's pulled back. And I've heard from a number of people kind of joking that, if Clinton is victorious in the next 6 to 12 months, someone's got to get punched in the nose. Who is it going to be? It doesn't seem like anyone's necessarily sure. Is it going to be Putin? Is it going to be Kim Jong-un? Is it going to be Khomeini? But it does feel, you hear this talk that things have kind of gone too far the other direction, and countries are testing us, whether it's the Russians in Syria or Ukraine, the Chinese in the South China Sea. You see a government in Lebanon now. You could see a much more pro-Iranian government in Beirut, a Philippine government aligning themselves with the Chinese. It's a lot of stuff going on. And so I think you're going to see an attempt to be much more assertive under Clinton. Whether she can do it in a party that has this Bernie Sanders element is unclear. But assuming she wins, I think that's the way we're going with Trump. I'm not even going to go there.
So wait for the punch.
So first, I just want to thank Abbas for chairing the session. And second, I want to congratulate Jay on finishing this book and a terrific talk. But I also want to challenge you all right now as you walk out. We are in a time when facts don't seem to matter, when investigative journalists are reduced to opining on television in 20-second sound bites. And as an academic, I'm really worried about this. I'm really scared about this, that we do not support research, journalistic work, and in-depth investigative journalism like Jay does. I've been on the other side of the interaction with this gentleman when I worked at the White House, and even in the campaign, now I think about it, in 2008, where he would ask questions we didn't like, and then he'd write stuff we didn't like, and we would all say, who screwed that up, that we didn't spin Jay the right way? Well, it turns out that you don't spin Mr. Solomon the right way, because he does that kind of work, and he then takes time to do this kind of work. And I just implore upon you, as citizens of America, we have to support this kind of work. We have to support this kind of research, and that's why you got to go buy the book right now. Thank you very much.